Every Thursday, a little girl gives cupcakes to her garbage man, spreading smiles with every sweet treat. But her dad senses something more behind the garbage man's brightened days. Following him, what he discovers is a tale of hidden lives and quiet sacrifices that will change their neighborhood forever. Why do these cupcakes mean so much? What secret is the garbage man harboring? Unwrap this story of unexpected connections and the powerful impact of small kindnesses. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, casting warm golden patches on the flour-dusted countertop. 8-year-old Mia stood on her step stool, her dark ponytail swinging as she stirred the cupcake batter with determined focus. Her father, Greg, watched from nearby, ready to help if needed. "Careful with the mixing, sweetie," Greg said, smiling as a small cloud of flour puffed up from the bowl. Mia giggled, her nose crinkling. "I know, Daddy, these have to be perfect for Mr. Clark." The kitchen filled with the sweet smell of vanilla as Greg helped Mia pour the batter into the cupcake tin. While they waited for the cupcakes to bake, Mia sat at the kitchen table, swinging her legs and drawing pictures on paper she would use to decorate the gift box. "Did you know Mr. Clark always waves at me when he drives by?" Mia said, carefully coloring a rainbow. "Even when he's super busy." The timer dinged, and Greg pulled the golden brown cupcakes from the oven. After they cooled, Mia got to work decorating them with careful precision. Her small hands guided the piping bag filled with buttercream frosting, creating swirls of blue and pink on each cupcake. "These sprinkles look like tiny stars," she said, sprinkling them carefully on top. "Mr. Clark said stars remind him of wishes coming true." Greg watched his daughter's dedication with wonder. Such a simple act, baking cupcakes for their garbage man, yet he could see how much joy it brought to both Mia and Mr. Clark. Every Thursday morning for the past month, Mia had insisted on baking something special for him. "You really care about making Mr. Clark happy, don't you?" Greg asked, helping her clean up the sprinkles that had missed their target. Mia nodded seriously. "He looked so sad that first day, Daddy, but now he smiles real big whenever he sees us." She carefully placed each cupcake in the box she had decorated with drawings and bright ribbons. The rumble of the garbage truck grew louder as it approached their house. Mia's eyes lit up, and she carefully lifted the box of cupcakes. He's here," she exclaimed, bouncing on her toes. Greg opened the front door and they stepped outside just as Mr. Clark's truck pulled up. The tall man's tired face transformed into a bright smile when he saw Mia holding her gift. "Good morning, Miss Mia," Mr. Clark called out, climbing down from his truck. "What do you have there?" "We made you cupcakes." Mia held up the box proudly. "With star sprinkles for wishes." Mr. Clark knelt down to accept the box, his eyes twinkling with genuine delight. "Well, isn't this the sweetest surprise a person could ask for? Thank you, Mia. You just made my whole day brighter." After Mr. Clark's truck rumbled away, Greg watched Mia skip back into the house to get ready for school. He stood on the porch for a moment longer, breathing in the crisp morning air and thinking about the way Mr. Clark's entire demeanor had changed when he saw those cupcakes. The man's eyes had lit up like Christmas lights, and his whole posture had transformed from weary to energized. Back inside, Greg cleaned up the kitchen while Mia gathered her school things, humming a cheerful tune as she packed her backpack. Once he'd dropped her off at school, waving as she joined her friends on the playground, he settled into his home office and picked up his phone to call his old friend, Tom. "You won't believe what's been happening here," Greg said, leaning back in his chair and running a hand through his hair. "Remember me telling you about my daughter baking cupcakes for our garbage man?" "Yeah, the weekly tradition, right?" Tom's voice crackled through the speaker, warm with interest. "There's something about it, Tom. You should see how this guy lights up when Mia gives him those cupcakes. It's like—" Greg paused, searching for the right words, his free hand gesturing in the empty room. "It's like she's giving him more than just baked goods. The look in his eyes, it's almost like relief or hope or something, like he's receiving a gift far more precious than frosted cake." "Maybe he just really likes cupcakes," Tom chuckled, the sound friendly and familiar. "No, it's deeper than that." Greg walked to his window. watching the spot where Mr. Clark's truck had been earlier, tire marks still visible in the morning dew. He treats those cupcakes like they're precious. And Mia told me he mentioned something about stars and wishes. There's a story there, I can feel it in my gut. So what are you thinking? Greg drummed his fingers on his desk, his reflection in the computer screen showing his furrowed brow. I think I'm going to follow him next week, just to see where he goes, what he does. Is that crazy? Maybe a little, Tom admitted with a gentle laugh. But I get it. Sometimes the smallest things can mean the most to people who are hurting. After ending the call, Greg pulled up his calendar on his computer, the screen casting a soft glow on his thoughtful face. He clicked on next Thursday and created a new event. Research. He'd take the morning off work, drop Mia at school, and then follow Mr. Clark's route at a safe distance. The plan was simple enough, but something told him the results might be anything but. As evening approached, Greg sat at his kitchen table, staring at the calendar on his phone while the setting sun painted long shadows across the room. Part of him felt guilty about planning to essentially spy on Mr. Clark, but his instincts told him there was something important here. Whatever made those simple cupcakes so meaningful to their garbage man, Greg needed to understand it. The mystery tugged at him like a persistent thread waiting to be unraveled. He set a reminder for next Thursday, trying to ignore the slight knot of worry in his stomach about what he might discover. The soft tick of the kitchen clock seemed to echo his racing thoughts, as he wondered what secrets lay behind Mr. Clark's grateful smiles. The following Thursday, Greg's car idled a few houses down from where Mr. Clark's garbage truck made its first stop. His heart pounded with nervous energy. This felt a bit like being a private investigator, though he wasn't entirely comfortable with the role. Mr. Clark worked efficiently, moving from house to house with practiced ease. Greg followed at a careful distance, making sure to stay far enough back that his repeated presence wouldn't raise suspicion. He noticed how Mr. Clark handled each bin with care, even taking time to replace them neatly on the curb. After about an hour, the garbage truck turned onto a street Greg didn't usually travel. The buildings here were more industrial, with wider spaces between them. The truck pulled into the parking lot of a plain brick building with a simple sign that read, Community Food Bank. Greg parked across the street, watching as Mr. Clark climbed down from his truck. To Greg's surprise, Mr. Clark went to the back of the vehicle and began unloading several cardboard boxes. Among them was the cheerfully decorated box that had contained Mia's cupcakes. "What are you up to?" Greg muttered to himself, his curiosity growing stronger by the minute. Mr. Clark carried the boxes inside, and after a moment's hesitation, Greg decided to follow. He waited a few minutes, then crossed the street and entered the building. Inside, the food bank was busy with activity. Volunteers moved about, organizing shelves and preparing food packages. Greg's eyes widened as he spotted Mr. Clark, who had removed his work jacket and was now wearing an apron. He moved through the space with surprising grace, directing other volunteers and organizing food distributions with the expertise of someone who clearly knew his way around a kitchen. "Clark, these pastries are beautiful," a volunteer called out, opening the box of cupcakes. "The kids are going to love these." Mr. Clark's face lit up with the same joy Greg had seen when Mia handed him the cupcakes. "They're special ones today," he said, carefully arranging them on a tray. "A little girl in my rote bakes them. They remind me of my restaurant days." Greg watched as Mr. Clark continued working, greeting everyone with warmth and sharing his obvious knowledge about food preparation. After about 30 minutes, Mr. Clark began gathering his things to leave. Greg took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Mr. Clark?" The garbage man turned, surprise flickering across his face. "Greg, what brings you here?" I followed you," Greg admitted, feeling his cheeks flush. "I noticed how much Mia's cupcakes meant to you, and I guess I wanted to understand why." Mr. Clark's expression softened. "Would you like to grab a coffee? I have a few minutes before I need to finish my route." They walked to the small break room where Mr. Clark poured them each a cup of coffee. "I used to be a chef," he began, his fingers wrapping around the warm cup. "Had my own restaurant. When your daughter started baking those cupcakes for me, It brought back memories of why I fell in love with food in the first place, the joy it brings people, the way it builds connections. The small cafe buzzed with quiet afternoon activity as Greg and Mr. Clark settled into a corner booth. Sunlight streamed through the window, warming their shoulders as they sat with their coffee cups between them. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods wafted through the air, creating a cozy atmosphere perfect for sharing stories. "My restaurant was called Clark's Home Kitchen," Mr. Clark said, his eyes taking on a distant look. "It wasn't fancy, just good, honest food made with love, the kind of place where regulars became family." As he spoke, memories flooded back. The bustling dining room filled with happy customers, steam rising from perfectly plated dishes, and the symphony of sounds from his kitchen, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables, the sizzle of pans, and the calls of "order up." He could almost feel the warmth of the kitchen tiles beneath his feet and hear the cheerful chatter of his loyal staff. "We were known for our weekend brunches," Mr. Clark continued, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Lines would stretch around the block. Every dish that left my kitchen, I made sure it was perfect. Our French toast was legendary. Thick-cut bread soaked overnight in vanilla custard, topped with fresh berries and real maple syrup." His expression darkened slightly as he reached the difficult part of his story. "It was a Tuesday night after closing. I got the call around midnight. By the time I arrived, flames were already shooting through the roof." He paused, staring into his coffee cup, his fingers tightening around the warm ceramic. "They never found out what caused it. Insurance called it inconclusive." Greg listened intently, watching the play of emotions across Mr. Clark's face. The afternoon sun cast shadows that seemed to deepen the lines of worry etched around his eyes. "After that, I just lost my way," Mr. Clark admitted, absently stirring his cooling coffee. "Couldn't bring myself to cook professionally again. Took the garbage route job because it was steady work, something to keep me busy." He gestured toward the window where people walked past on the sidewalk outside. "But then, something unexpected happened. I started connecting with people on my route. Your daughter's cupcakes. They reminded me why I loved cooking in the first place. The way food brings people together creates joy." Greg leaned forward, an idea taking shape in his mind, his eyes bright with excitement. "What if we organized a charity cooking event? Something to help you get back to your roots while giving back to the community." Mr. Clark's eyes widened slightly, a mix of hope and uncertainty crossing his face. "You really think people would be interested?" "Absolutely," Greg said firmly, placing his cup down with conviction. "We could partner with the food bank, maybe even raise funds for their programs. Your experience as a chef, combined with your connection to the community, it could be something really special." Mr. Clark was quiet for a moment, turning the idea over in his mind. Finally, he nodded, a cautious smile spreading across his face. "I'd like that. Maybe it's time to step back into the kitchen properly." "Let's meet tomorrow," Greg suggested, already mentally listing potential venues and supporters. "We can start planning, figure out the details." "Tomorrow," Mr. Clark agreed, his voice stronger now, a spark of his old confidence returning. "Yes, let's do that." The following day at the library, the ancient oak shelves towered around them as Greg and Mr. Clark settled into worn leather armchairs tucked away in a quiet corner. It was noon, and their paper coffee cups sat on a small table between them, steam rising in lazy spirals. The familiar scent of old books and polished wood surrounded them, creating a cozy atmosphere perfect for serious planning. Greg pulled out a folder from his messenger bag, its edges crisp with fresh printouts and research. "I've been thinking about this a lot since yesterday," he said, keeping his voice low to match the library's hushed atmosphere. "What if we organized something like a community kitchen night?" Mr. Clark leaned forward, his interest piqued, the leather chair creaking softly beneath him. "What exactly did you have in mind?" "Picture this," Greg said, gesturing with his hands, his enthusiasm barely contained despite the quiet setting. "We find a suitable venue, maybe the community center's kitchen. You could showcase some of your signature dishes from Clark's Home Kitchen, teach people a few cooking basics, and share your story." He paused, gauging Mr. Clark's reaction, watching as the older man's eyes lit up with interest. It would be a perfect way to reconnect with cooking and the community at the same time. Mr. Clark nodded slowly, considering the idea. His fingers tapped thoughtfully against his coffee cup, creating a soft rhythm against the paper surface. "And here's the best part," Greg continued, his eyes bright with enthusiasm, leaning closer across the small table. "We could charge a modest entry fee, maybe do a raffle, and donate all proceeds to the food bank, the same one you volunteer at." That could work," Mr. Clark said, his voice growing stronger with each word, his posture straightening with renewed purpose. "The food bank always needs extra support, especially during the summer months when donations typically drop off." Greg pulled out a fresh notepad and clicked his pen, the sound sharp in the quiet corner. "Let's start brainstorming. What kind of dishes would you want to feature?" They bent their heads together over the notepad, their coffee momentarily forgotten as ideas began to flow. Mr. Clark's expertise flowed freely now, his passion for cooking clearly reigniting as they discussed potential menu items and cooking demonstrations. The afternoon light shifted around them, casting longer shadows across their work. "We could do a mix of comfort food and some slightly fancier dishes," Mr. Clark suggested, his face animated, years seeming to fall away as he spoke. "Show people that good cooking doesn't have to be complicated or intimidating." Greg scribbled rapidly, filling page after page with ideas, his neat handwriting growing messier with excitement. They discussed possible dates, venue requirements, and ways to promote the event. Mr. Clark's knowledge of the local food scene proved invaluable as they listed potential suppliers and supporters, drawing from his years of experience in the industry. As their planning session drew to a close, Greg noticed Mr. Clark's eyes growing misty behind his glasses. The former chef cleared his throat, emotion catching in his voice. "I never thought—" He paused, composing himself, his hands clasped tightly together. "I never thought I'd get another chance like this. Thank you for believing in me." Greg extended his hand across the table, a gesture both professional and deeply personal. "Partners?" Mr. Clark gripped his hand firmly, a warm smile spreading across his face, reaching all the way to his eyes. "Partners." With all this enthusiasm, Mr. Clark's living room had transformed into a makeshift command center. Stacks of cookbooks teetered on the coffee table, while papers covered every available surface. Greg sat cross-legged on the floor, his laptop balanced on his knees while Mr. Clark occupied his well-worn armchair. "Let's start with the menu," Mr. Clark said, pulling a notepad closer. "I'm thinking we should use what's in season. The farmers market will be bustling next month." Greg nodded, typing rapidly. "Local ingredients would really resonate with the community. What dishes are you considering?" Mr. Clark's eyes lit up as he flipped through his old recipe book. "Fresh tomato gazpacho to start, maybe some herb-crusted chicken with roasted summer vegetables." He paused, a warm smile crossing his face. "And for dessert, we absolutely must include Mia's cupcakes." "The cupcakes that started it all," Greg agreed. "But how do we make them special for the event?" "I've been thinking about that," Mr. Clark said, reaching for another cookbook. "What if we did a demonstration of how to elevate simple cupcakes? We could show people how to make professional-looking decorations, maybe add some unique flavoring combinations." Greg switched to his marketing document. "I can create some eye-catching flyers. We'll need both digital and print versions." His fingers flew across the keyboard. "Social media will be key. We can showcase your journey, maybe do some behind-the-scenes posts of the preparation." "Just keep it honest," Mr. Clark said quietly. "No need for fancy filters or exaggeration. Let's show people the real heart of what we're doing." They moved on to logistics, spreading out a rough sketch of the community center's layout on the floor between them. Mr. Clark pointed to different areas. "We'll need at least 3 cooking stations here, here, and here. The demonstration area should be central with good visibility." "What about equipment?" Greg asked, creating a new spreadsheet. "I can bring some of my old professional gear," Mr. Clark offered. "We'll need to rent the rest. Industrial mixers, extra ovens, refrigeration units." They worked methodically through the afternoon, creating lists and timelines. Greg organized everything into clear categories: marketing deadlines, equipment delivery dates, volunteer schedules. Mr. Clark focused on the culinary aspects, noting down ingredient quantities and cooking times. As the sun began to set, Greg checked his watch. "We've got a solid foundation here," he said, saving his files. "I'll start on the marketing materials tomorrow." Mr. Clark walked him to the door, then paused. "I think I'll spend the evening testing some cupcake recipes. Want to make sure we get them just right." Greg gathered his laptop and notes, feeling a surge of optimism about their progress. The timeline they'd created was ambitious but achievable. As he headed toward his car, he could already smell the sweet aroma of baking drifting from Mr. Clark's kitchen window. The next morning, Greg and Mr. Clark stood outside Sweet Dreams Bakery. Through the spotless window, they could see Marie, the owner, carefully arranging fresh pastries in the gleaming display case. Her skilled hands moved with practiced precision, creating an artful arrangement of croissants and Danish. The little brass bell chimed melodiously as they entered, and the warm, comforting scent of fresh bread and vanilla enveloped them. "Mr. Clark," Marie's round face brightened instantly. "I haven't seen you in ages. Not since—" She trailed off, glancing away awkwardly, her fingers fidgeting with her flour-dusted apron. "Since my restaurant," Mr. Clark finished gently, his voice carrying no trace of bitterness. "But I'm getting back in the kitchen, Marie, for a good cause." Greg stepped forward, confidently explaining their charity event plans while Mr. Clark examined the gleaming display cases with obvious nostalgia, his eyes lingering on the perfectly golden croissants. Marie listened intently, nodding along, her expression growing more enthusiastic with each detail. "Of course I'll help," she said without hesitation, her voice warm and sincere. "Flour, sugar, butter, whatever you need. Just give me the list. I'll make sure you have the best quality ingredients." Their next stop was Green Meadow Farm, where old Pete Davidson was checking his prized tomato plants. The farmer's weathered face, tanned from decades under the sun, crinkled with interest as they described the event. His keen eyes sparkled with enthusiasm beneath his well-worn straw hat. "A charity cooking demonstration, eh?" Pete wiped his calloused hands on his faded overalls. "And you say it's all going to benefit the food bank?" "Every penny," Greg confirmed, gesturing to emphasize the point. Pete gestured expansively at his verdant fields where rows of vegetables stretched toward the horizon. "Take what you need. These vegetables would love to be part of something special. Got some beautiful herbs, too, if you're interested." At Kitchen Plus, the restaurant supply store, they found an equally warm reception. The owner, Sarah Chen, remembered Mr. Clark from his restaurant days, her face lighting up with recognition the moment they walked through the door. "Your seafood pasta was legendary," she said enthusiastically, leading them through aisles of gleaming stainless steel equipment. "We'd be honored to help. I can lend you professional-grade mixers, heating elements, prep stations, whatever you need. Just say the word." Their final stop was the community center, where manager Tom Roberts met them in his cluttered but welcoming office. Framed pictures of community events covered the walls like a colorful patchwork quilt, and a half-empty coffee cup sat on his desk amid scattered papers. "We've got the perfect space," Tom said, leading them to the expansive main hall. "Good ventilation, plenty of electrical outlets for your equipment. And since it's for charity," he smiled warmly, "the rental fee is waived. It's the least we can do." Back at Mr. Clark's cozy house, they spread their notes across his well-worn kitchen table. The day's impressive successes were written in Greg's neat, precise handwriting. Ingredients, equipment, venue, all donated with genuine enthusiasm and warmth. "I can't believe how generous everyone's been," Mr. Clark said softly, running his finger down the extensive list of donations, his voice thick with emotion. Greg smiled, methodically organizing the papers into neat piles. "They remember you, Mr. Clark. They remember your food, your kindness. The community hasn't forgotten. Not by a long shot." They sat there in comfortable silence, surrounded by the evidence of their neighbors' overwhelming support, both feeling the profound warmth of a community coming together to help one of their own. The afternoon light filtered through the kitchen window, casting a golden glow over their plans for the future. The next day, Mr. Clark and Greg pulled into the parking lot. Their cars were the first to arrive, but within minutes, a steady stream of volunteers began filing in, their faces bright with enthusiasm despite the early hour. "Good morning, everyone," Greg called out, unlocking the main doors. "Thank you all for coming." Mr. Clark stood in the doorway of the industrial kitchen, surveying the space with practiced eyes. The stainless steel surfaces gleamed, and the professional equipment from Kitchen Plus had been delivered the previous evening. A group of volunteers gathered around him, waiting for instructions. "Let's get the prep station set up first," he said, pointing to different areas of the kitchen. "We'll need the mixing bowls here, and the heating elements over there." In the main hall, volunteers worked like a well-oiled machine. Some hung colorful banners, while others arranged chairs in neat rows facing the demonstration area. Tables were dressed in crisp white cloths, and centerpieces featuring fresh flowers from Green Meadow Farm added splashes of color throughout the room. The double doors swung open and Mia bounced in, her mother following close behind. Both carried large boxes filled with carefully packaged cupcakes. "Mr. Clark, Greg," Mia called out, her face glowing with excitement. "We made extra special ones today." Mr. Clark walked over to inspect the cupcakes, each one decorated with precise care and artistic flair. "These are beautiful, Mia. They'll be perfect for the dessert table." Mia and her mother began arranging the cupcakes on a tiered display stand at the center of the dessert table. Each tier showcased different flavors and designs, creating a stunning focal point that drew everyone's attention. As the morning progressed, Greg gathered all the volunteers in the main hall. He held up a clipboard, checking off items as he spoke. "Okay, everyone, let's go through the schedule one last time. Doors open at noon. Mr. Clark's first demonstration starts at 12:30. Mia's cupcake decoration workshop is at 2. The volunteers nodded along, each clear about their roles and responsibilities. Mr. Clark watched from the side, taking in the transformed space and the dedicated group of people who had come together to help. "I'd like to say something," Mr. Clark said, stepping forward once Greg finished. His voice was thick with emotion as he addressed the room. "Thank you all for being here today. Your support means more than you know." The room hummed with positive energy as final preparations were made. At her station, Mia stood proudly beside her cupcake display, adjusting each treat until it was perfectly positioned. The dessert table had become a work of art, with her cupcakes as the crown jewel of the presentation. At noon sharp, Greg opened the community center's doors, and a wave of excited guests streamed in, their chatter filling the previously quiet space. The air was rich with the aroma of simmering sauces and fresh herbs, while soft jazz music played in the background, creating a sophisticated yet welcoming atmosphere. Volunteers in crisp white aprons guided people to their seats, their faces bright with welcoming smiles as they handed out elegantly printed menus. In the bustling kitchen, Mr. Clark moved with renewed confidence, directing his team of volunteer helpers with the precision of a seasoned chef. His eyes sparkled with focus and determination as he worked. "Sarah, we need those appetizers plated now. Jason, start on the sauce reduction," he called out, his voice carrying above the clatter of pots and pans and the sizzle of ingredients hitting hot surfaces. His hands flew as he demonstrated the proper way to arrange the colorful vegetables on each plate, creating edible works of art that drew gasps of admiration from the kitchen staff. Out in the main hall, Greg circulated among the tables, stopping to chat with each group of guests, his genuine warmth evident in every interaction. "Have you seen our donation station?" he asked a young couple who were admiring the decorations. "Every dollar goes directly to the local food bank, helping families in our community." He gestured toward a beautifully decorated table where volunteers were accepting contributions and handing out thank you cards decorated with hand-drawn hearts. At the dessert station, Mia stood on a small step stool behind her cupcake display, her eyes sparkling with excitement as she adjusted her miniature chef's hat. "This one has vanilla bean frosting with raspberry filling," she explained to an elderly woman who smiled warmly at her enthusiasm, clearly charmed by the young baker's passion. "And these ones," she pointed to another tier, her small finger directing attention to a row of perfectly frosted treats, "have chocolate ganache and sea salt caramel inside." The evening progressed smoothly, with plates of beautifully prepared food making their way from the kitchen to appreciative guests. The donation box filled steadily with bills and checks, and the room buzzed with conversation and laughter, punctuated by the occasional clink of silverware against china plates. As the event drew to a close, Greg stepped to the center of the room and gently tapped a glass for attention, the clear ring silencing the cheerful chatter. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the man who made this evening possible, Chef Clark." Mr. Clark emerged from the kitchen, his chef's coat showing signs of the evening's work, with a few telltale spots of sauce speaking to his hands-on involvement. The room erupted in applause, and he stood there, taking in the moment with visible emotion. His face flushed with a mixture of exhaustion and joy as he looked around at the successful event they had created together, his eyes growing misty at the outpouring of support. The standing ovation continued, echoing through the community center as guests showed their appreciation for an extraordinary evening that had exceeded everyone's expectations. As the evening progressed, the warm glow of strategically placed lighting at the community center created an intimate atmosphere. Among the satisfied guests, several local food critics moved from table to table, their phones and notepads at the ready, occasionally pausing to snap photos of particularly striking presentations. One critic in particular, Sarah Chen from the Town Herald, lingered near the dessert station, carefully examining each creation with the practiced eye of a seasoned reviewer. "These flavors are remarkable," Sarah said, taking detailed notes as she sampled a cupcake, her eyes closing briefly in appreciation. She approached Mr. Clark, who had stepped out of the kitchen for a brief moment, his chef's coat crisp despite the evening's work. "Chef Clark, the balance of sweet and savory in your menu is exceptional, and these cupcakes, they're quite special. The texture is perfect." Mr. Clark smiled warmly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "The cupcakes are actually Mia's creation. She's been perfecting her recipe for months, testing different combinations until she got it just right." Throughout the room, excited conversations bubbled up as guests shared their impressions, the sound of clinking cutlery mixing with delighted laughter. "Have you tried the roasted vegetable medley?" one guest asked another, gesturing enthusiastically with her fork. "The seasoning is perfect, and the way the vegetables are cut makes such a difference." "And it's all for such a wonderful cause," replied her companion, dropping another donation into the collection box, which was already half full of generous contributions. Greg moved through the crowd with his phone in hand, capturing photos and videos of the evening, pausing occasionally to chat with guests and gather their feedback. He paused to post a live update showing a table of beaming guests enjoying their desserts, the lighting perfect for social media. "Another successful evening at our charity cooking event. Cooking for community? Chef Clark," he typed, adding a photo of Mr. Clark presenting a beautifully plated main course, the colors vibrant against the white porcelain. Comments and likes began pouring in immediately, creating a steady stream of notifications. Greg shared them with the guests nearby, his face bright with excitement. "Look at this. Best meal I've had in years. When is the next event? Those desserts look amazing. People are loving it." As the evening drew to a close, Mr. Clark stood at the front of the room, his chef's coat showing the honest signs of a busy night in the kitchen, a few spots of sauce here and there like badges of honor. The room fell quiet as he began to speak, all eyes turning toward him with respect and admiration. "I want to thank each and every one of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, hands clasped in front of him. "A few months ago, I wasn't sure I'd ever cook professionally again, but thanks to this community and especially to Greg and young Mia, I've found my way back to what I love most, creating food that brings people together and makes a difference in our community." The crowd burst into enthusiastic applause, many rising to their feet in a spontaneous standing ovation. Mr. Clark stood there, taking in the moment, his face glowing with pride and gratitude as the successful evening came to an end, the warmth of community support filling the room like a comfortable embrace. The streetlights cast long shadows as Mr. Clark walked toward his apartment building. His feet ached from hours in the kitchen, but his heart felt light. The evening's success played through his mind like a beautiful melody. The satisfied smiles, the warm compliments, and most importantly, the substantial donations collected for the food bank. What a night, he muttered to himself, fishing his keys from his pocket. The cool evening air carried the faint scent of autumn, and crickets chirped in the nearby bushes. His shoulders felt heavy with exhaustion, but it was the good kind of tired that comes from meaningful work. As he reached his front door, something caught his eye. There, partially visible beneath his plain brown doormat, was a folded piece of paper. Mr. Clark frowned, bending down to retrieve it. The paper was crisp and white, folded into precise quarters. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded it under the dim porch light. The message, typed in stark black letters, made his blood run cold. Stop cooking. Stop planning events. You lost everything once. It can happen again. This is your only warning. Mr. Clark's breath caught in his throat. The paper shook in his hands as his eyes darted up and down the street. The familiar neighborhood suddenly felt alien and threatening. Shadows seemed darker, deeper. Every rustle of leaves made him flinch. The joy of the evening drained away, replaced by a creeping dread that crawled up his spine. He remembered the night his restaurant burned. The flames, the smoke, the devastating loss. Could there be a connection? His hands fumbled with the keys as he hurried inside his apartment. The lock clicked once, twice, and then the deadbolt slid home with a heavy thunk. Mr. Clark leaned against the door, his heart pounding. The threatening note was still clutched in his hand, its corners crumpled from his tight grip. In the silence of his apartment, he stared at the words again, trying to make sense of them. Who would want to stop him? Why now, just when things were finally looking up? The questions swirled in his mind as he sank into his armchair, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. The next morning, Mr. Clark was seated in his kitchen with low spirits. After tossing and turning all night, he sat at his small kitchen table, staring at his untouched coffee. With trembling fingers, he picked up his phone and dialed Greg's number. "Greg, can you come over? Something happened last night." His voice was tight with worry. 20 minutes later, Greg arrived, concern etched on his face. Mr. Clark wordlessly handed him the threatening note. Greg's expression darkened as he read the message, his jaw clenching. "I found it under my doormat when I got home," Mr. Clark explained, running his hands through his disheveled hair. What if this is connected to the restaurant fire? Maybe I should just stop now before—" "No," Greg interrupted firmly, placing the note on the table. "We can't let someone's cowardly threats derail everything we've built." He sat down across from Mr. Clark, his eyes steady and determined. "The event was a huge success. People loved your food and we raised significant money for the food bank. That's exactly why someone might feel threatened." Mr. Clark nodded slowly, wrapping his hands around his coffee mug for comfort. "But what if they follow through? I can't go through another loss like that, Greg. I just can't." "I understand," Greg said softly. "Should we take this to the police?" They sat in thoughtful silence for a moment, considering the implications. Mr. Clark shook his head. Without any real evidence or specific threats, what can they do? And what if going to the police makes things worse? "You might be right," Greg agreed reluctantly. "I have another idea. Let's talk to the local news about this. After the event's success, they're bound to be supportive and try to help us figure this out. When word of this gets out, I'm certain we'll be able to get some leads." Mr. Clark managed a weak smile, grateful for his friend's support. "Thank you, Greg. I don't know what I'd do without your help." Greg stood up, gathering his things. "We'll figure this out," he promised, placing a reassuring hand on Mr. Clark's shoulder. "In the meantime, try to remember how many people are rooting for you now. Don't let one threat undo all the good we've accomplished." As Greg headed toward the door, he turned back. "I'll get in touch with the news station and let them know we're coming over tomorrow." Mr. Clark watched Greg leave, feeling slightly more grounded than before. He tried to focus on the previous evening's success, the smiling faces, the compliments, little Mia's proud grin as she served her cupcakes. But beneath these warm memories, a nagging fear remained, keeping him on edge. The news station buzzed with activity as Greg and Mr. Clark followed a production assistant through the maze of corridors. Bright lights illuminated the studio, and the constant hum of equipment filled the air. Sarah Chen, the journalist known for her investigative reporting, greeted them with a warm smile. "Thank you both for coming," she said, guiding them to their seats. "We'll start with some background about the charity event, then address the more serious developments." The makeup artist made quick work of reducing the shine on their faces while the camera crew adjusted their equipment. Mr. Clark fidgeted with his tie, clearly nervous about being on camera. "Just relax," Greg whispered. "Tell your story like you told me." Once the cameras started rolling, Sarah's professional demeanor took over. "Today we're joined by former restaurateur Mr. Clark and his business partner Greg Thompson. They recently organized a successful charity event, but their triumph was overshadowed by something disturbing." Mr. Clark took a deep breath before speaking. "I used to own a restaurant downtown until it burned down under mysterious circumstances. I lost everything. But thanks to the support of my well-wishers, especially Greg and his daughter Mia, I found my way back to cooking." His voice grew stronger as he described the charity event's success. Sarah leaned forward. "And then something happened after the event?" "Yes," Mr. Clark replied, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I found a threatening note under my door, warning me to stop my culinary pursuits. Given your restaurant's mysterious fire, this must be particularly concerning," Sarah observed, her expression serious. Greg jumped in, his voice firm and determined. "We refuse to let intimidation stop us. Mr. Clark has become an integral part of our community, volunteering at the food bank and inspiring others. Someone might want to stop him, but we're asking anyone with information to come forward." The cameras captured every word as Sarah directed the conversation, skillfully highlighting the contrast between Mr. Clark's community service and the threatening note. The studio lights felt warm, but Mr. Clark maintained his composure as he shared his story. "To whoever left that note," Greg added, looking directly into the camera, "know that our community stands united. We won't be intimidated." Sarah wrapped up the segment with a clear call to action. "If anyone has information about the threats against Mr. Clark or the previous restaurant fire, please contact the number on your screen. For Channel 8 News, I'm Sarah Chen." "And we're clear," called the director. Greg and Mr. Clark thanked Sarah and the crew before making their way out of the studio. In the parking lot, they paused, both hoping their public appeal would make a difference. The day after the news segment aired, Mr. Clark noticed a shift in his daily interactions. While picking up his morning coffee at the corner Cup Cafe, 3 different customers approached his table. "We saw you on the news," said an elderly woman, placing her hand gently on his shoulder. "It's just terrible what someone's trying to do to you. We're all behind you." Greg, sitting across from Mr. Clark, watched as more people stopped to offer support. A construction worker in his dusty boots spoke up from the counter. "My crew and I eat at the food bank sometimes. Your cooking makes a real difference, Mr. Clark." Throughout the day, similar encounters continued. At the grocery store, the butcher pulled Mr. Clark aside. "Hey, I was at your charity event. There was this guy who kept hanging around the back entrance. Didn't look like he belonged there, wore a dark jacket, and kept his cap real low." Greg immediately pulled out his notebook. "Can you remember anything else about him?" "Yes. Yeah, he had a slight limp when he walked, seemed to favor his right leg." Later that afternoon, while checking out the potential location for their new cafe, a teenage girl working at the smoothie shop next door approached them. "My mom was working the register at the event," she said. "She mentioned seeing someone suspicious too. Said he was medium height, probably in his 50s, and kept asking weird questions about the kitchen setup." Greg added these details to his growing list of descriptions. The pattern of observations continued as they walked down Main Street. A postal worker mentioned seeing someone matching the description lurking near the community center's back alley after the event. Just as they were about to call it a day, Marcus, who owned the hardware store across from the community center, waved them over. "I've got security cameras that cover the street," he said, leading them into his office. "Been meaning to check the footage from that night since I heard what happened." They gathered around Marcus's computer screen as he pulled up the footage from the night of the event. The black and white video showed the steady stream of guests arriving and leaving. "Wait," Greg said, pointing to a figure in the corner of the screen. "Can you zoom in there?" Marcus adjusted the footage, but the image became pixelated. They could make out someone standing in the shadows between the buildings, watching the event's entrance, but the quality was too poor to distinguish any clear features. "They stayed there for almost an hour," Marcus noted, checking the timestamp, "then disappeared right before the event ended." Mr. Clark leaned closer to the screen, squinting at the grainy figure. "At least we know someone was definitely watching," he said quietly. Greg carefully copied down the timestamps and what little detail they could make out from the footage. Though the image wasn't clear enough for identification, it confirmed the community members' reports of a suspicious presence at the event. The kitchen clock ticked steadily as Mr. Clark sat at his small wooden table, steam rising from his chamomile tea. At 2 a.m., the apartment felt especially quiet, making the weight of his thoughts even heavier. He spread out the notes Greg had taken, studying the descriptions they'd gathered throughout the day. "Medium height, 50s, limping on the right leg," he murmured, running his finger down the list. The description tugged at something in his memory, but he couldn't quite place it. He took another sip of tea, letting the warm liquid calm his nerves. Moving to his living room closet, Mr. Clark pulled out a dusty cardboard box labeled Restaurant Staff Records. He hadn't looked through these files since the fire, finding it too painful. But now, he carefully lifted each folder, scanning through employee information and old photographs. James Thompson, too young. Maria Rodriguez, still working at another restaurant downtown. Peter Walsh, moved to Florida years ago. One by one, he eliminated former employees, looking for anyone who matched the description or might hold a grudge. His phone buzzed, making him jump. Greg's name lit up the screen. "You're up late," Greg said, concern evident in his voice. "Couldn't sleep," Mr. Clark replied, rubbing his tired eyes. "Been going through old employee files." "Find anything?" "Nothing concrete, just..." Mr. Clark paused, shifting through more papers. "Dead ends and maybes." "Listen," Greg's voice was firm but gentle. "If we don't identify this person soon, we should consider hiring private security for the cafe opening. I've already looked into some options." Mr. Clark nodded, though Greg couldn't see him. "Maybe. But first..." He glanced out his window, seeing the sky beginning to lighten. "I think I need to visit the old place. Sometimes being there helps me think clearer." "Want me to come with you?" "No, I need to do this alone, but thanks, Greg, for everything." After hanging up, Mr. Clark walked to his window. The first hints of dawn painted the sky in soft blues and pinks. He grabbed his jacket, knowing exactly where he needed to go. As the morning sun cast long shadows, Mr. Clark and Greg stood outside their first potential cafe location. Despite his restless night, Mr. Clark felt energized by the prospect of moving forward with their plans. "This one has good foot traffic," Greg noted, checking items off his clipboard as they walked through the empty storefront. Sunlight streamed through large windows, illuminating the wooden floors and exposed brick walls. Mr. Clark ran his hand along a counter. "I can see it now. Display cases here filled with fresh pastries, comfortable seating there by the windows." His eyes lit up as he gestured around the space. "We could do seasonal menus, maybe even cooking classes for the community." They visited 3 more locations throughout the morning. Each space had its charm, but none quite clicked. At their 4th stop, in a cozy neighborhood lined with maple trees, something felt different. "This corner spot has character," Greg said as they approached the building. The property owner, Mrs. Martinez, greeted them with a warm smile. "The previous tenant was here for 20 years, she explained, unlocking the door. "Retired last month. Space has good bones." Inside, Mr. Clark's culinary imagination sparked immediately. The layout was perfect. An open kitchen design would allow interaction with customers. Large windows wrapped around 2 sides, flooding the space with natural light. The ventilation system was upgraded last year, Mrs. Martinez mentioned, and the kitchen equipment is negotiable in the lease. Greg and Mr. Clark exchanged knowing looks as they toured the space. The location was ideal, close enough to residential areas for regular customers, but also accessible to downtown workers. I'm thinking family-style seating here, Mr. Clark said, pointing to one corner. Long tables where people can gather, share meals together. Maybe do community dinners once a month. The neighborhood would love that, Mrs. Martinez nodded enthusiastically. We need more places that bring people together. They settled into a discussion about lease terms, with Mrs. Martinez showing genuine interest in their vision for a community-focused cafe. The numbers looked promising, and her flexibility on the terms showed she valued their concept over maximum profit. As they wrapped up the viewing, Greg and Mr. Clark stood on the sidewalk, looking back at the space. The afternoon sun highlighted the building's potential, and for the first time in weeks, both men felt genuinely hopeful. This could be it, Greg said quietly. Mr. Clark nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. It feels right, doesn't it? Following up on their newfound location, Mr. Clark and Greg sat in plush leather chairs at real estate office, reviewing the lease agreement one final time. Everything looks in order, Greg said, adjusting his reading glasses as he flipped through the pages. Mr. Clark nodded, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest with nervous energy. Mrs. Martinez sat across from them, her professional demeanor warm and encouraging. Once we sign these papers, the space is yours, she said, reaching for her pen. Just then, her cell phone rang. She glanced at the screen, her expression shifting. Excuse me, gentlemen, I need to take this. She stepped away quickly, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor as she moved to a corner of the office. Mr. Clark and Greg watched as she spoke in hushed tones, her back turned to them. Her shoulders tensed, and she kept nodding, her free hand gesturing in short, agitated movements. When she returned to the desk, her face had lost its warmth. I'm so sorry, she began, not quite meeting their eyes. There's been a complication. I won't be able to lease the property to you after all. Greg leaned forward. What kind of complication? I'm afraid I can't discuss the details, Mrs. Martinez replied, gathering the unsigned papers. There are some unexpected obligations that have come up. I truly am sorry. Mr. Clark sat very still, his earlier excitement deflating like a punctured balloon. Is there anything we can do? Perhaps adjust the terms? Mrs. Martinez shook her head. No, I'm sorry, this isn't negotiable. Outside the office, Greg and Mr. Clark stood on the sidewalk, still processing what had happened. The busy street traffic continued around them, oblivious to their disappointment. We can't let this stop us, Greg said firmly, placing a supportive hand on Mr. Clark's shoulder. There are other properties. Mr. Clark straightened his shoulders, drawing a deep breath. You're right. We've come too far to give up now. They began walking down the street, their determination growing with each step. We'll find something better, Greg assured him. This is just a temporary setback. Agreed, Mr. Clark replied, his voice steady despite the disappointment. We keep looking until we find the right place. The following morning, Mr. Clark and Greg huddled over a map spread across Greg's car hood. Their breath formed small clouds in the crisp air while they marked potential locations with red circles. I've got 6 places lined up for us to see today, Greg said, tapping the map with his pen. All different styles, different neighborhoods. Mr. Clark nodded, pulling his jacket tighter against the morning chill. After yesterday, I'm trying to keep an open mind. Their first stop was a corner location in the business district. The space was sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the interior with natural light. Mr. Clark walked the perimeter, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. The kitchen would need a complete overhaul, he noted, peering into the bare back room, but the dining area has potential. They visited 3 more locations before lunch. A converted Victorian house that needed too much work, a strip mall spot that felt too impersonal, and a downtown storefront that was perfect but well outside their budget. Maybe we need to think differently, Greg suggested as they drove to their next destination. Sometimes the best opportunities don't look like opportunities at first. He pulled up to an old brick building that had once been a neighborhood library. The architecture was beautiful, with arched windows and detailed stonework, but the interior needed significant renovation. I know it needs work, Greg said, watching Mr. Clark's expression carefully. But look at these bones, Those built-in shelves could display fresh baked goods. That reading nook could become a cozy seating area. Mr. Clark's eyes lit up as he walked through the space, his chef's imagination taking flight. The main room could be the dining area, he said, gesturing broadly. And that side room would make a perfect kitchen with some modifications. Their final stop of the day was an unexpected find, a former artist's studio in a bustling neighborhood. The space featured high ceilings, exposed brick walls, and large windows that overlooked a small courtyard. The location was ideal, situated between a popular shopping district and several office buildings. "The rent is negotiable," Greg said, reviewing his notes, "and the owner is willing to work with us on the renovations." Mr. Clark ran his hand along one of the brick walls, feeling the rough texture beneath his fingers. "This place has character," he said thoughtfully. "It would need work, but it feels right," Greg finished smiling. They spent the next hour measuring spaces and discussing possibilities. The former studio space could be transformed into an inviting cafe with unique charm. The courtyard offered potential for outdoor seating in warmer weather, and the kitchen area, while needing updates, was well proportioned for their needs. As the afternoon light began to fade, they stood in the center of the empty studio, both feeling a spark of hope they hadn't expected to find so soon after yesterday's disappointment. "Should we pursue this one?" Greg asked, already knowing the answer from the way Mr. Clark was studying the space with growing enthusiasm. "Yes," Mr. Clark replied firmly. "Let's see if we can make this work." The weekend brought perfect weather for the community's annual spring festival in Cedar Park. Mr. Clark and Greg had decided to attend, hoping the festive atmosphere would lift their spirits after days of property hunting. Children ran between carnival games while parents lounged on checkered blankets spread across the grass. The scent of cotton candy and grilled corn wafted through the air as local vendors called out to passing crowds. "Is that Mr. Clark? And Greg?" a familiar voice called out. They turned to see Richard Thompson, the philanthropist who had made a generous donation during their charity event. His silver hair caught the sunlight as he approached them with a warm smile. "I caught your segment on the news," Richard said, shaking their hands. "And I heard about what happened with the lease. Terrible business, that." Greg nodded. "We're still looking for the right spot." "Actually," Richard said, his eyes brightening, "I might have a solution. You remember the old Maple Street diner? I bought the building last year, and it's been sitting empty since the renovation." Mr. Clark's eyes widened. Everyone knew the location. It was right in the heart of downtown, surrounded by offices and shops, with plenty of foot traffic. "The kitchen's already fully equipped," Richard continued. "It just needs someone with vision to bring it back to life. And after seeing what you did with that charity event, I think you're exactly what the place needs." "That's incredibly generous," Mr. Clark said carefully. "But we couldn't possibly—" "Let me finish," Richard interrupted gently. "First 6 months at half rent, with an option to buy after 2 years if things go well. I'd rather see the place in good hands than sitting empty." Greg pulled out his phone to check his calendar. "Could we see it today?" 20 minutes later, they stood in front of a charming brick building with large windows and a corner entrance. Inside, sunlight streamed across polished hardwood floors and newly installed fixtures. The kitchen gleamed with stainless steel appliances, and a cozy alcove offered the perfect spot for displaying baked goods. "The community misses having a good cafe here," Richard explained, leading them through the space. "The previous tenants did all the major renovations before they had to relocate for family reasons." Mr. Clark ran his hand along the smooth counter, already envisioning the setup. The space was perfect, better than anything they had seen in their searches. "The terms," Greg said, ever practical. "Could we get those in writing?" Richard pulled a folder from his briefcase. "I had my lawyer draw up a preliminary agreement. Take it home, review it, make any suggestions. I want this to work for everyone." Mr. Clark stood in the center of what would be the dining room, taking in the possibilities. Through the windows, he could see people walking past, some glancing in curiously. A young mother waved, recognizing him from the news segment. "What do you think?" Greg asked quietly. Mr. Clark turned to Richard, extending his hand. "We'd be honored to accept your offer." Wonderful, Richard beamed, shaking both their hands. I'll have my lawyer send over the final paperwork tomorrow. The keys are yours as soon as everything's signed. As they walked through the space one more time, Greg was already pulling out his notebook, jotting down ideas for the layout. Mr. Clark stood by the window, watching the neighborhood bustle past, feeling for the first time in weeks that everything might work out after all. The morning sun streamed through the newly cleaned windows of the cafe as Mr. Clark unlocked the front door. Behind him, a group of volunteers from the charity event gathered, armed with cleaning supplies, paintbrushes, and toolboxes. "All right, everyone," Greg called out, holding up a detailed floor plan. "Let's start by removing these old wall fixtures and prepping the surfaces for our local artists." The space quickly filled with the sounds of work and friendly chatter. 2 volunteers carefully dismantled outdated light fixtures, while others scrubbed years of accumulated grime from the walls. Mr. Clark moved through the groups, offering encouragement and sharing his vision for each area. "This corner," he explained to Sarah, a local artist who had volunteered her talents, "I'm thinking of a mural that captures the spirit of our community, something warm and welcoming." Sarah nodded enthusiastically, already sketching ideas in her notebook. "I can see it. Maybe incorporating elements from the neighborhood, the park across the street, people coming together." In the kitchen, Mr. Clark supervised the installation of new equipment with meticulous attention to detail. He checked the positioning of each appliance, ensuring optimal workflow for his future culinary creations. "The ovens need to be exactly 3 feet apart," he instructed the installation team. "We'll need space for multiple bakers during rush hours." Greg managed the front of house renovations, coordinating with local craftsmen who had offered their services. A carpenter worked on building custom shelving units, while another volunteer group painted the walls in warm, inviting colors. Throughout the day, more community members dropped by to help. Some brought homemade lunches to share, others offered their skills, from electrical work to decorative touches. Local artists began working on their contributions, adding splashes of color and character to the walls. "This feels right," Mr. Clark said quietly to Greg as they took a brief break, watching the transformation unfold around them. All these people coming together to help build something special. By late afternoon, the cafe had undergone a remarkable transformation. The walls gleamed with fresh paint and the beginnings of beautiful murals. New light fixtures cast a warm glow across the polished floors. In the kitchen, state-of-the-art equipment stood ready for its first use. Mr. Clark stood in the center of the main room, taking in the progress. The space was beginning to match the vision he'd held in his heart. Not just a cafe, but a gathering place for the community that had shown him such kindness. A few days passed with the cafe completely renovated and looking just as Mr. Clark had wished. Mr. Clark adjusted his crisp white chef's apron as he faced his assembled staff of 12, their eager faces reflecting the same excitement he felt in his heart. "Welcome, everyone," he began, his voice warm and steady. "Today, we're going to focus on what makes a cafe more than just a place to eat. It's about creating an experience that brings people back." The staff settled into comfortable chairs arranged in a semicircle, notepads ready. Mr. Clark paced slowly, gesturing to the art-covered walls around them. "Each person who walks through that door is part of our community," he explained, sharing a story about an elderly customer from his previous restaurant who came in every Sunday for years, just for his chocolate croissants. "She didn't just come for the pastry. She came because we remembered her name, asked about her grandchildren, and made her feel like family." In the gleaming kitchen, Mr. Clark and his head chef, Maria, demonstrated the preparation of their signature dishes. Steam rose from pots as they explained proper techniques, timing, and presentation. The staff clustered around the central island, watching intently as Mr. Clark crafted a perfect eggs benedict. "The hollandaise needs to be silky smooth," he explained, whisking the sauce with practiced movements. "But the real secret is in the timing. Everything must come together at exactly the right moment." When they reached the dessert section, Mr. Clark's face lit up as he shared Mia's special cupcake recipe. "These cupcakes represent the heart of what we're creating here," he said, demonstrating the precise swirl of frosting that had become Mia's trademark. The afternoon shifted to role-playing exercises, with staff taking turns acting as servers and customers. Mr. Clark observed as they handled various scenarios, from dealing with special dietary requests to managing busy rush hours. "Remember," he called out during a particularly challenging scenario, "stay calm and focused. Every challenge is an opportunity to show our commitment to service." The staff worked together, offering suggestions and support to each other as they practiced. Laughter filled the room when someone acted out an especially demanding customer, but the learning remained serious and focused. As the training session wound down, Mr. Clark gathered everyone near the front window. With careful movements, he hung the final menu in its frame, a carefully curated selection of dishes that represented both his culinary expertise and the community's spirit. He stepped back, standing among his team, and admired how the menu looked against the backdrop of their warm, inviting space. His hands trembled slightly with a mixture of nerves and excitement as he thought about the upcoming opening day. It was the day of the grand opening, and crowds gathered around the cafe's freshly painted exterior. Colorful flowers and elegant ribbons adorned every corner, transforming the space into a celebration of new beginnings. Mr. Clark stood at the entrance, his chef's coat pristine, while little Mia bounced excitedly beside him in her special cupcake-patterned dress. Cameras flashed as Mr. Clark and Mia gripped the oversized scissors together. "Ready?" he whispered to her, and she nodded enthusiastically. Together, they cut the red ribbon, met by applause and cheers from the assembled crowd. Inside, the cafe hummed with life as guests explored the space. Mr. Clark moved through the room, stopping at each table to greet people personally. His eyes crinkled with joy as he shook hands and received warm wishes from community members who had supported him through the journey. "The Eggs Benedict is incredible," one guest called out, while another praised the perfectly brewed coffee. Mr. Clark paused at each compliment, taking time to share the stories behind his recipes and thank people for coming. A local string quartet played cheerful tunes in the corner, their music floating through the air and mixing with the happy chatter of guests. Mia, along with several other children, weaved through the crowd carrying trays of mini cupcakes. "These are special opening day flavors," she announced proudly to each person she served. The mayor, dressed in his formal suit with the city pin gleaming on his lapel, tapped his glass for attention. The room quieted as he spoke about the importance of small businesses and community spirit. "This cafe," the mayor declared, gesturing to the beautiful space around them, "represents more than just excellent food. It represents resilience, community support, and the power of never giving up on your dreams. Mr. Clark has shown us what's possible when we stand together." As the afternoon light began to soften, the crowds thinned, but the warmth of the day's success lingered. Mr. Clark found Greg near the coffee counter, both men watching the remaining guests enjoy their desserts. "I can't believe we're actually here," Mr. Clark said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Greg, for believing in me when I'd stopped believing in myself." Greg smiled, patting his friend's shoulder as they observed their dream turned reality, the cafe alive with the very spirit of community they'd hoped to create. The cafe buzzed with the usual afternoon crowd when Sarah Chen, the city's most respected food critic, slipped into a corner table. Her practiced movements were subtle as she pulled out her notepad and phone, documenting each detail of the warm, inviting space. Mr. Clark noticed her arrival from the kitchen window, but maintained his composure, focusing on preparing each dish with the same care he always did. He watched as she ordered a selection of items from the regular menu, her pen moving across the paper between careful bites. After she finished her initial courses, Mr. Clark emerged from the kitchen carrying a carefully arranged tasting platter. The wooden board featured miniature versions of his signature dishes: herb-crusted salmon, wild mushroom risotto, and the crown jewel, a savory version of Mia's cupcake recipe, transformed into a delicate cheese and chive creation. "This is something special we've been working on," Mr. Clark explained, placing the platter before her. "It's a collaboration between traditional cooking and a child's imagination." Sarah's eyebrows raised with interest as she studied the presentation. "Tell me more about these savory cupcakes," she said, reaching for her pen. Mr. Clark pulled up a chair at her invitation and shared the story of Mia's original cupcakes and how they had sparked his return to cooking. The critic leaned forward, clearly engaged as he described his journey from loss to renewal. "The community here," he explained, gesturing to the busy cafe. "They gave me back my purpose." As if on cue, a regular customer from a nearby table chimed in. "The food here isn't just delicious, it's made with heart," she said warmly. "You can taste the difference." Other diners joined the conversation, sharing their own experiences with the cafe. An elderly gentleman described how he'd made new friends at the community table, while a young mother praised the weekly kids' baking workshops. Sarah took it all in, her pen moving quickly across the page. She sampled each item on the tasting platter, her expressions growing more appreciative with each bite. The savory cupcake earned a particular nod of approval. As she prepared to leave, she turned to Mr. Clark with a genuine smile. "You've created something special here," she said, gathering her things. "I look forward to sharing your story with my readers. Expect a very favorable review." Mr. Clark watched her leave, allowing himself a small smile of satisfaction. He knew better than to celebrate too early, but the warmth of the critic's response gave him hope for what the review might bring. Early morning the next day, Mr. Clark and his staff huddled around a laptop on the counter. The aroma of fresh coffee and baking bread filled the air while they waited for the webpage to load. Greg stood beside Mr. Clark, his hand resting supportively on his friend's shoulder. "It's up," one of the servers announced, pointing at the screen as Sarah Chen's review appeared. Mr. Clark took a deep breath as they began to read. The review's headline immediately caught everyone's attention. "Local gem serves up more than just exceptional food." As they read through the detailed critique, smiles spread across their faces. Sarah had praised everything from the welcoming atmosphere to the innovative menu. She particularly highlighted the savory cupcakes, calling them a delightful surprise that perfectly represents this establishment's creative spirit. "Listen to this part," Greg said, reading aloud. "In a city full of trendy eateries, this cafe stands apart through its genuine commitment to both culinary excellence and community connection. It's more than just a restaurant. It's a testament to the power of local support and passionate cooking." Mr. Clark's eyes grew misty as the staff broke into spontaneous applause. He raised his hands to quiet them, though his smile remained bright. "This is wonderful news," he said, "but it's also a responsibility. People will come here with high expectations now. We need to make sure every dish, every cup of coffee, every greeting lives up to this review." The staff nodded seriously as Mr. Clark continued his impromptu morning meeting. He walked them through their signature dishes again, emphasizing the importance of consistency and attention to detail. His passion was infectious, and the team's enthusiasm grew with each word. Meanwhile, Greg had already begun updating their social media profiles. He carefully selected quotes from the review, pairing them with photos of their most popular dishes. The cafe's website got a fresh update too, with the review prominently featured on the homepage. "The online reservation requests are already coming in," Greg announced, showing Mr. Clark his phone screen. "The review's been shared over 100 times already." As the clock approached opening time, they could see people gathering outside the entrance, phones in hand, presumably having read the review. Mr. Clark took his position near the doorway, watching as Greg unlocked the doors for their first customers of the day. The morning light streamed in as new faces entered, their eyes scanning the space with eager anticipation. Mr. Clark stood proudly in his chef's coat, ready to welcome them to the cafe that had become so much more than just a dream restored. The morning rush had just begun to slow when Sarah, one of the cafe's servers, hurried into Mr. Clark's office with worry etched across her face. "Mr. Clark, there's something wrong with the produce delivery," she said, wringing her hands. "Most of it looks spoiled, and it's nothing like our usual quality." Mr. Clark followed her to the storage area where boxes of wilted lettuce, overripe tomatoes, and bruised vegetables sat waiting. His heart sank as he examined the unusable ingredients. This was their main morning delivery, crucial for the lunch service. Just as he finished arranging for an emergency delivery from another supplier, a loud crash echoed from the kitchen. The main convection oven had stopped working, smoke curling from its vents. The lunch crowd was already forming, and the kitchen staff scrambled to adapt their cooking methods. "I'm so sorry, but your order will take an extra 20 minutes, servers repeated apologetically to table after table. Customers shifted in their seats, checking watches and frowning at their menus. Some stood up and left, shaking their heads. The day took an even darker turn when a health inspector walked in, clipboard in hand. "We've received several anonymous complaints about food safety violations," she announced, adjusting her glasses. "I'll need to conduct a thorough inspection immediately." Mr. Clark maintained his composure as he accompanied the inspector through the kitchen. Despite the morning's chaos, he knew they maintained strict cleanliness standards. Yet the inspector seemed determined to find issues, marking down minor infractions that wouldn't normally warrant concern. During the inspection, Greg rushed in with his laptop. "Clark, you need to see this," he said urgently. Online food forums were buzzing with posts about alleged food safety concerns at the cafe. Anonymous users claimed to have gotten sick after eating there, though no such incidents had been reported to the staff. "These posts are all from new accounts," Greg pointed out. "They appeared within hours of each other." The inspection and online rumors cast a shadow over the cafe. Regular customers called to cancel reservations, and walk-in traffic slowed to a trickle. As the sun set and the last customer left, Mr. Clark gathered his staff in the dining room. The usually cheerful space felt heavy with concern, as servers and kitchen staff settled into chairs, their faces tired and worried. "I know today has been challenging," Mr. Clark began, standing at the head of the pushed-together tables. "But I believe these incidents aren't random coincidences. We need to work together to protect what we've built." The staff shared their observations from the day, noting suspicious details about the delivery truck and the timing of the online posts. Together, they began forming a plan to document everything and strengthen their quality control measures. In the dimly lit office of the cafe, Mr. Clark and Greg huddled around a computer monitor, their faces illuminated by the screen's blue glow. Security cameras had been installed throughout the cafe the previous day, following the string of suspicious incidents that had plagued their business. "Look here," Greg said, pointing to footage from early morning. "Someone's tampering with the delivery at 4:30 a.m. before our staff arrives." Mr. Clark leaned closer, squinting at the grainy image. The figure moved with purpose, clearly familiar with their delivery schedule and procedures. They watched as the person systematically opened boxes of produce, replacing fresh vegetables with spoiled ones. "Wait!" Mr. Clark's voice caught in his throat. "Pause it there." Greg froze the frame as the figure turned toward the camera. Despite the poor lighting, the face was unmistakable. Mr. Clark's hands began to shake. "That's Marcus," he whispered, "my former sous chef from the old restaurant." Greg quickly pulled up footage from different days, showing the same figure lurking near the kitchen entrance. In one clip, Marcus could be seen tampering with the wiring of their kitchen equipment. "He disappeared right after the fire," Mr. Clark said, his voice heavy with realization. "I always wondered, but I never wanted to believe." The footage painted a clear picture. Marcus had been systematically sabotaging their operations, from damaging equipment to switching out deliveries. His knowledge of restaurant operations made him particularly effective at causing disruptions that would be hard to trace. "We have enough evidence now," Greg said, downloading the footage onto a flash drive. "We should take this to the police." Mr. Clark shook his head slowly. "No, I need to confront him first. I need to understand why." They reviewed the footage one more time, noting Marcus's patterns and timing. Mr. Clark called his staff together, sharing the discovery and implementing new security measures. They would be ready when Marcus made his next move. With the evidence secured and his staff informed, Mr. Clark sat at his desk, preparing himself for the confrontation that would finally bring closure to years of uncertainty and recent troubles. The autumn breeze rustled through the park's trees as Mr. Clark stood near an old wooden bench, away from the joggers and dog walkers. His heart pounded as he spotted Marcus approaching from the walking path, looking older and more weathered than he remembered. "Thanks for meeting me," Mr. Clark said, his voice steady despite his nerves. Marcus nodded curtly, keeping his distance. "What's this about?" Without a word, Mr. Clark pulled out his phone and played the security footage. Marcus's face drained of color as he watched himself tampering with the deliveries and equipment. "Want to explain?" Mr. Clark asked, stopping the video. "The spoiled food, the equipment failures, the health inspector visits, it was all you, wasn't it?" Marcus's shoulders slumped. He sank onto the bench, running his hands through his graying hair. His voice cracked. I couldn't stand seeing you succeed again. And the fire at my old restaurant? Mr. Clark pressed, though he already knew the answer. Tears welled up in Marcus's eyes. I was drunk that night, angry. You were getting all the attention, all the praise, the reviews, the awards. He wiped his face with his sleeve. I'd worked just as hard as you, but nothing I did ever measured up. So you burned down my restaurant? Mr. Clark's voice rose slightly, drawing a curious glance from a passing cyclist. After the fire, I tried opening my own place, Marcus continued, his voice hollow. Failed miserably. Went through 3 restaurants in 5 years. But seeing you bounce back, starting fresh with this cafe, he shook his head. It brought back all that jealousy, all that resentment. I convinced myself you didn't deserve another chance when I couldn't even make one work. Mr. Clark stood silently, processing the confession. The man before him wasn't the confident sous chef he remembered, but a broken person consumed by bitterness and failure. I have to report this to the police, Mr. Clark said finally. The fire, the sabotage. People could have been hurt. You understand that, right? Marcus nodded weakly. I know. I think I need help. Real help. He looked up at Mr. Clark, his eyes red. I'm sorry. For everything. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I truly am sorry. Mr. Clark pulled out his phone again, his finger hovering over the police department's number. You're right, it doesn't fix anything. But owning up to what you've done is the first step toward making things right. The following day, the local newspaper's headline brought a sense of closure to the cafe. Former chef arrested for restaurant arson and sabotage. Mr. Clark noticed customers reading the story at their tables, their expressions a mix of shock and relief. That afternoon, he gathered his staff and regular patrons in the sun-filled main dining room. The cafe's warm lighting cast a gentle glow over the crowd as Mr. Clark stood before them, his chef's coat crisp and white. I want to thank everyone for standing by us during these challenging times, he began, his voice steady and sincere. The incidents we experienced were unfortunate, but they've only made us stronger. We've enhanced our safety protocols and quality controls. Your trust means everything to us. The crowd nodded appreciatively, and several regular customers shared stories of their unwavering faith in the cafe. Their words touched Mr. Clark deeply, reinforcing his commitment to the community. Later that week, Mr. Clark unveiled his new initiative, the Rising Stars Mentorship Program. He converted the cafe's private dining room into a teaching space during off hours, equipped with additional cooking stations for hands-on training. Every great chef started somewhere, he explained to the first group of aspiring chefs, mostly young adults from local culinary schools. This program isn't just about cooking techniques. It's about building character, fostering creativity, and supporting each other's growth. The celebration event showcasing the mentorship program transformed the cafe into a vibrant exhibition of culinary talent. 5 stations featured young chefs preparing signature dishes they'd developed under Mr. Clark's guidance. The aroma of fresh herbs and sautéing vegetables filled the air as guests moved from station to station, sampling creative interpretations of classic dishes. Sarah, one of the mentees, presented her modern take on traditional comfort food, while Marcus, another young chef, demonstrated molecular gastronomy techniques he'd perfected. The pride in their eyes as they explained their dishes to interested guests reminded Mr. Clark of his own early days in the kitchen. As the evening wound down, Mr. Clark watched his mentees cleaning their stations with professional precision. The cafe hummed with the satisfied murmurs of departing guests and the gentle clink of dishes being cleared. Looking around at the space that had weathered so much drama, he felt a deep sense of contentment. The cafe had become more than just a restaurant. It was now a place of learning, growth, and second chances. The last guests filtered out and the staff began their closing routine. Mr. Clark stood in the doorway of his kitchen, watching the young chefs share laughs while wiping down counters and storing equipment. The sight filled him with quiet satisfaction, knowing that from adversity had grown something truly meaningful. If you enjoyed the story of Mr. Clark, I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.